Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy. Today's conversation is one that is long overdue. Many of you know Mark Curtis, the founder of Hemlock Knots, and someone who has been in this space for a very long time doing incredible work. He is such a great guy. I really like him. I really appreciate him. And I'm really thankful that we were finally able to get together and that he was willing to come on. I think that I had originally planned to release this as like one of my midweek conversations, but I really wanted to have my conversation with Mark be one of this regular Sunday numbered episodes. So if we talk about it as a midweek episode, that's why I've decided to change the schedule and add his in right now. I also have so many other topics that I'm working on. I have a number of really great conversations that are just waiting to be released, and I'm working on other things. So things are crazy right now, but I really loved engaging with Mark Curtis and hearing more about his story and what he has been working on and what he's working on now. So thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic conversation. I am really excited to be here with Mark Curtis, who on just the spur of the moment dropped everything and agreed to come and talk to me. And I've been wanting to talk to Mark officially on the podcast for a long time. And so I'm really glad that we are finally we're able to make it work out and have a reason to. So Mark, thanks you and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And this all came from a conversation on the phone about an hour ago or so, right?
Right. So. We're just jumping on right now. But yeah, there are a variety of reasons. I've wanted to talk to Mark for a long time. And so we decided to go ahead and do it as a live chat because Mark Curtis absolutely deserves his own full episode of 132 Problems. But I actually don't want to wait and try to fit our conversation into an official Sunday episode. So we're doing it as a live chat, but I'm hoping it will get at least as much play as a Sunday episode. So please join in the conversation, share this conversation, because I think there's a lot of really important information here, particularly right now as there are some detractors and people attacking my channel and what I'm doing, and also what the work that Mark has done. So I just wanted to come on and set the record straight and also introduce what Mark has done and let people know a little bit more about him. So does that sound okay, Mark?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Go into this. Okay, so for those who don't know, Mark is the founder of the website, the YouTube channel, and the Facebook discussion group of Hemlock Knots. So I'm going to go ahead and share this is the website right here that you can see. And Mark, for those who don't know how brilliant the title is of your website, can you explain where that came from?
Yeah, it's actually based upon, it's metaphorical, and it's based upon something that Joseph Smith is attributed to have said a long time ago. And let me try to find, it's on the About Us page. I've got the exact quote that I'll read. According to 1844, January 21st, in the History of the Church, Volume 6, it stated that Joseph Smith said, "There's been a great difficulty in getting anything into the heads of this generation. It's been like splitting hemlock knots. With a corn dodger for a wedge and a pumpkin for a beetle, even the saints are slow to understand. I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions." So the metaphor there is that, like, getting people to really understand stuff that's outside of their normal paradigm and their way of thinking or how they were raised or whatever faith system they were given at birth, people fly apart and it's difficult. It's like splitting these tough knots inside of a log. If you're ever splitting wood and they're hemlock, it's a very hard wood. And so these knots are, they'll break saws, they'll dull axes on these things, trying to get these things split open. So I think Joseph Smith, if that quote is really something he said, I use the metaphor there because that's what we're trying to do here is like split these topics open. Let's dissect them. Let's get them opened up a little bit, even though it's going to be a rough conversation for a lot of people.
That's great. I thought it was I love that quote. I hope it is true. I like how careful you are with sources. And that's one thing we'll talk about, that instead of you saying Joseph Smith said, you say there's a source that claims that Joseph Smith said, right? Because we need to be careful.
Somebody said he said this. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Which right, is the core of what we're trying to do, right? Trying to figure out what actually happened back then, as hard as that question can be.
Right. But it is a great quote. And I love the symbol of hemlock knots, like you said, that it's so hard to get people to consider a new paradigm. I think Jesus said the same thing, like anything that, I should have looked up the quote, but Abraham you have and Moses you have, but anything new that you weren't born with, you can't accept it, right? It's like human nature every single time.
New wine in old bottles. I mean, there's similar ideas taught throughout all of religion and Christianity and Mormonism. It's not an uncommon thing to understand the idea that getting human beings in our human nature to open up to new paradigms is a task, a big task.
Yes.
It's messy. So.
It is. It's challenging. So, okay. So there are a couple of different directions I want to go. I want to first, let me just introduce a couple of things. And then I want to ask you a little bit about your journey and why you started Hemlock Knots, how you started it, when you started it, how you came on to this topic and what you mostly wanted to accomplish. But at first, I want to introduce the reason that we're talking about this is because some of the detractors who are coming after me are assuming, I just think out of sheer ignorance, that like I am the mother, the great mother of this entire movement, right? And I feel I feel offended on behalf of you and others who have been in Hemlock Knots, who have been, I also wanted to talk to Whitney Horning, who published her book in 2019. Well, I started my YouTube channel in early 2022. And I was not even discussing, I intentionally wanted to stay away from the topic of Joseph Smith and his involvement in polygamy because I hadn't yet known about Hemlock Knots. I hadn't yet known about Whitney's book. I just was focusing on the scriptures and what I had learned about polygamy itself. So I feel I take great issue with people claiming that this entire movement is based on me and my work. And I think that there are people who are rightly offended by that claim and that assumption. So I wanted to set the record straight for a number of reasons. First of all, I deserve nothing like that responsibility or that credit or that blame, however people want to look at it, right? I came into this and we came together because we've had similar interests, right? So I think the first time we met was when you came to my stake fireside on polygamy, right? And that's I think the one time, no, I've met you a couple of times since then, but that was when we met. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, so I guess I just feel like people have been on this topic well before I came here, and people have actually in your movement in Hemlock, I don't even know if I should call it a movement, but I know there have been people in Hemlock Knots and people who were on these topics before who were extremely impatient with me being slow to come to the conclusion myself that Joseph wasn't involved. And then there are still a lot of people who were in this movement before who have left the church, which is not something that I have felt at all necessary to do and is not something I have felt at all inspired to do, who are also impatient with me still being in the church, right? So I think that a lot of the comments on my videos or on my posts that are very opposed to the church generally are people who were in this movement before I got here and who have a slightly different perspective on it, because I'm in the unique space of feeling like, yes, it's true that polygamy was never of God, and that polygamy, I now have become more and more committed to my conclusion that polygamy did not originate with Joseph Smith. However, I don't think that at all means that people should leave the church. I see it a very different way. So that was a big, long explanation. And now I'll turn the time over to you, Mark, to kind of tell us, well, you can respond to that if you want. And then I would love to know your journey and how and why and when you started Hemlock Knots.
Yeah. So for me, I've always been interested in like trying to figure out what happened historically and stuff like that, even for like reading the Old Testament and things. Those things just fascinate me. History is always a topic I'm interested in. But I think for me, 2017 is when I had a stepson at the time who had come to me he had read the CES letter. I almost said the Wentworth letter. No, the CES letter, right, which has all these highly controversial things in it. And so he came to me and was, hey, what's up with this, and this? And so, to try to help him out, I said, you know what, like, I'll study this and we can share, I can share with you what I find. I'll try to help you make sense of this a little more, because it is pretty shocking on the surface. And so I went down the rabbit hole. I've always been very studious. But I went down the rabbit hole of, okay, let me try to figure out this polygamy thing, and I'll teach him how it ties into the gospel and the plan of salvation, and where Joseph Smith taught about it, and, all this stuff, where it's at in the New Testament. But I was like, okay, let me just lay it out, because I'm sure there's a lot of detail there. So, 7 or 8 months later, I've got an exhaustive list and a timeline and all these sources sorted by date. And I just had this wealth of knowledge, and it was all done in like Google Docs at the time. And so I started to realize, wow, like there's really not a lot in support of this doctrine, which is essential, according to some, to get into celestial kingdom or whatever they say. And so I remember it's almost like the less I found, the more intense I got at trying to find it. Right. And so and there were little hints there, but the things that I did find in support of it, I noticed a pattern. They were all very, even back then, as someone who believed that it could be a concept that had some merit to it, maybe some inspiration to it, I remember just like rolling my eyes at these sources, thinking like, well, why aren't there better sources propping up that side of the argument? Why is everything late? Why is everything second, third hand? It seems like there's a couple things that get into the first hand, but I don't know. It's just a mess.
Are you talking about like, why aren't there better sources from Joseph teaching this doctrine? And is that kind of what you're referring to? Why aren't there better sources from Joseph?
Because I'm looking for firsthand contemporary stuff, ideally if I can get it. And I just, most of the stuff I did find that did fit that, more credible quality of a source was actually him teaching against it. And so,
right,
as you can imagine, I was like, wait, what? This cannot be the case. And so I'm asking people, I'm reading books, and I'm going into pretty exhaustive. I got pretty obsessed with it, you could say, right? So, but I wanted to settle that issue for my stepson at the time and for myself, because I was starting to get curious, like, where did this come from, right? There's a lot of stuff against it in the scriptures, but I don't see, a lot on the other side. So that's how it all started. And I was studying with a group of friends, and we were very active in studying the scriptures and things. And so there were a lot of people asking me for my notes. It kind of like, I had a lot of people on Facebook Messenger saying, hey, can you send me that timeline? And I just got so tired of forwarding links to all these things all day long that I just thought, hey, I'm just going to throw it on a website and wash my hands of this, and then I could just add to it as I find new stuff. That's the birth of Hemlock Knots.
You're a web designer guy, right? Isn't that like in your wheelhouse of what you do? So that wasn't.
Yeah, I'm a digital marketer for tech companies here in Utah, lead generation, online advertising and things. So I have built websites, but I'm an amateur. I'm not someone who's software programming friendly. I can get stuff up on WordPress and things and do my best, but I wouldn't call myself a web developer. But I was willing to do this for the community because it was going to make my life easier. Even though it was a lot of work to put this up there, I'm glad I did, because I was just constantly being asked for these resources. And hey, Mark, can you look up this quote for me? And I'm like, here, just you look it up yourself. There it is.
That's great. Well, it is. I think it's a great. You do a really good job with the design elements and I love how you've done it. I think it's really good.
Thank you. I wish it was more searchable. I wish you could search for particular quotes in a database. If I would go back in time, I would have done it that way, but thank you for the compliment.
Yeah. So you started researching this in 2017, compiled your notes into your Word documents or your Google Docs or whichever it was, you said. Mm-hmm. And then you started the website, did you say in early 2019? Is that when? Do you remember?
So at the end of 2019, I had a bunch of Google Docs, and it was the beginning of, I remember it was like right about when COVID started to happen, because I was working from home at the time. And, in the afternoons when I was done with work, I would just switch gears and go into this project. Right. So it was probably late or early 2020, right on COVID, that the website actually went up. And then the first episode we did where there was a podcast and YouTube, that didn't come until like May of 21.
Okay, so here is, I looked this up as well, and here is your first episode. Let me get this onto the stage. Here is your first episode of Hemlock Knots on YouTube, Intro to the Hemlock Knots Show. And if people can see right here, the date, it was July 12th, 2021, that you posted your first episode that you had recorded that was talking about what you were going to do. And I'll go back to your page so people can see more of your episodes, because I know you're not producing content consistently, but there are a lot of really good episodes that you have created. And so I guess I wanted to show that also, to show I'm in a way trying to like give people credit where credit is due, because my first episode was in February of 2022. So almost a full year after you started. And then I didn't get into the topic of specifically Joseph's polygamy as a focus until almost a year into that. So almost into 2023, when you started in 2021 on the topic of Joseph Smith's polygamy, right? Wasn't that basically what Hemlock Knots was centered?
I mean, I started there because that's where my question was for my stepson. So like, and it's a big one. It's hard to get off of polygamy because everyone wants to go back to it. And so I'm constantly being dragged back to the polygamy questions, even though I've got dozens of studies I've done on lots of other topics, baptisms for the dead and tithing and the priesthood and
right.
all kinds of stuff that I would love to just unload one day. I just, life's busy now. I've kind of lost interest in some of those questions. I've explored them. And at the time they were a passion for mine, but like, I just don't have that burning desire anymore to spend hours a day researching some of these topics as much. I'll still listen to things and learn a little bit here and there, but I've got other things that are more of a focus now.
Sure. And that's so fair. In fact, we talked about that in our phone conversation about how it's kind of like, while you're passionate about it, while you have the need, then you do it. And then hopefully, eventually you get the answers you need, or at least you get it settled and move on to something else.
Yeah. If I spent the rest of my life studying did Joseph do polygamy or not, I'd be an idiot. It just doesn't matter to me that much to spend that much time on it. But I'm glad that I went through that, the process of research and study and learning about sources, because it's made me and a lot of people in the community much better researchers, discerners. Just like we're not quite as gullible to the flyby, drive-by, secondhand statements that some people cling to. And so, I mean, some call it unhealthy skepticism, but we look at the court, like how the courts are run. There's statute of limitations that basically say you can't convict somebody 50 years later of something that they did. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Unless there's like a really heavy paper trail. In some instances, you might be able to. The statute of limitations is broad. But for most things, even in society on a civil level, we understand how fallible testimony is, and late recollections, and people coming together and saying, "Oh, he told me this," and judges throw these out all the time, like hearsay. He said, she said. Like we don't take any of that seriously in our society when there's bickering about who said what. So why do we get so into the weeds 200 years ago with very, very sparse records? And a lot of these records have been edited and cleaned up and changed and whitewashed and rewritten. And I mean, it's really just a kind of a frivolous pursuit, I think, to really try to understand fully what happened back then, because I don't think anybody can really know what happened back then. We just don't have enough detail. I mean, if Joseph Smith was on surveillance 24/7 and we had records to all of it, like a reality show, we might be able to do a better job at figuring out what happened, right? But the record keeping was just so sparse.
Right. And I'm going to push back on something you said. And maybe it's a different perspective, because I am newer to this topic of specifically of Joseph's polygamy, but I don't see it as at all frivolous. I think you used that word, and maybe you meant it in a different way. But to me, I think it is fascinating. And I did for a long time push away from, I did not want to get sucked into the topic of Joseph's polygamy because I knew it would just take over. And what I felt was far more important was the question of God, the question of God's polygamy is, like, what is truth? Because that's why I think this topic is interesting. But I have found, or I felt eventually really led to talk about Joseph in service to the greater question of God, right? Like how does God work with us as humans? And what is the story that's going on here? But then it wasn't even that so much as like I find it offensive how bad the information is and how certain people are about it, especially when we're talking about, for me, especially when we're talking about Emma, the claims that we make about her on these horrible sources. And I believe she deserves way better than that. And then I guess, and I am, I think there are people who have spent their whole lives on these topics because they are historians who find the historical questions really interesting, And so I do think that, anyway, I think that we can come to better conclusions the more we study it and the deeper we dig into it. But I think where we completely agree is taking issue with someone heard some quote. There's some quote in one of our manuals that Joseph supposedly said this, so we know all we need to know. Or on the other side, someone sees one source and then all of a sudden it's all settled and we know all we need to know. I think it is really valuable to dive in with an open mind, just willing to find where the evidence is.
Yeah. It could still be important, but also kind of like what's the word? Maybe frivolous wasn't the right word, but meaning that like it's difficult to do. You're going to waste a lot of time if you try to figure out exactly what Joseph said, when, and verbatim. Like it's just, you can't do that with what we have. The records aren't good enough to really piece together the full picture. So, but I think there are shortcuts. If you're interested in like other questions, which is, do the scriptures teach polygamy? That's a different question than did Joseph participate in it, right? And so we need to separate those and go after that, because I think the record's pretty clear in the scriptures. Like that's kind of like an easy one. Like it's a layup. Like the scriptures teach that polygamy is okay. Show me one example, right? Besides twisting some verse into meaning some weird thing, right? So I think those are questions. We just have to separate the questions, because right now they're all kind of stitched together and they're all intertwined. And so whether or not Joseph did polygamy has nothing to do with whether or not polygamy is morally correct according to your scriptures.
Right.
They're not connected. Like it's not the same thing, Right.
That's one thing I've been so,
it doesn't matter if you did it or not.
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
It's so hard to separate out those two questions, just like you're talking about. In fact, even when I try to engage with people in discussions or debates, which I'm always like, let's separate the two topics. Is polygamy of God and then is polygamy of Joseph Smith? They are different topics and they don't have that much bearing on one another. Although I have found with people trying to help people that are still in polygamy today, and, there are people still suffering in polygamy today, I have been told how helpful it would be to their work to be able to show people the evidence that maybe it didn't start with Joseph Smith. And so it does. Yeah. People's mindsets still are very much, if Joseph did it, then it's good, which I disagree with. But more, I just want to find the truth.
If Joseph Smith is your God and he's the source of your morality, then yeah. If he did it, then you get permission to do it too. But that's just such a limited way of thinking. It's like, well, are we believing in a God or a higher morality for the entire universe? Or are we just going off of one man? At Book of Mormon even says that, you're cursed if you put your trust in the arm of flesh. It doesn't specify which flesh, just any of it, including Joseph Smith, right?
I was just thinking that same thing. It's really interesting that a lot of people who bring up that scripture to oppose how we put our current church leaders on pedestals, right?
Oh,
and so they see it there.
They're not infallible. They're fallible. But then when it comes to Joseph, they're like, no, he's infallible. Like it's the same trap. Nobody's infallible. It's ridiculous to think that even Joseph Smith didn't make mistakes. And anyone familiar with church history knows that he made a ton of mistakes. A ton. He was human, and he admitted to that. Largely. Right. Yeah.
Which actually is something I love about him, that he was willing to publicly publish his rebukes from God, right? How many times has he called to repentance in the Doctrine and Covenants? You said it was something like 18. I think you've counted them.
I think at least. Yeah. There's just, he had need to repent and you're not quite ready for this. Right. They're not always stern rebukes, but it just shows like that he wasn't someone who was perfect and put together and ready to go from day one. There's a lot of refinement that he had to go through as a person, I think.
Right. But the fact that he published those makes me have so much respect for him. Because one thing I've really been thinking about lately, I've said it a few times in some recent interviews, is that we have a problematic dichotomy. Either you are infallible and cannot lead the people astray, or you are capable of repentance. You can't have both, right? If in your position you can't make a mistake, that precludes you from the possibility of any degree of repentance, which infallibility is not part of the gospel anywhere, whereas faith and repentance are the first two principles of the gospel. And so I think the fact that Joseph was willing to not only actually be, but fully present himself as a flawed person in need of ongoing repentance speaks to his character. I think that that's incredibly impressive. And I wish that we would follow that example a little bit more in our current leadership.
And even within the pages of the Book of Mormon, you don't have anything in this like this record is perfect. It's all the word of God. Like that's what humans say about the book. The book itself says, hey, Moroni, the author in the book or whoever, they say that, there's a lot of flaws in this book. Like, or it's not perfect. If I could write in this language, it would be better. Like they're admitting weakness. If you study closely, like they're not saying that their record is fallible. In fact, they're pointing out a lot of errors in their own records, right? And so this idea of fallibility, it's ridiculous because it's also like, let's put it this way. If the LDS Church is saying, hey, our leaders should be trusted, they'll never lead you astray, and that's out of the Doctrine and Covenants Declaration too. Wilford Woodruff, I think, was the first that, it's based upon a Brigham Young quote earlier. Brigham Young actually said the same gist of it, but the first published one that we're all aware of in our scriptures with Wilford Woodruff, it's not in the program, right? Program's misspelled. It's not the program to lead people astray. God would remove this person if he did. And yet in the same breath, those same people are saying Joseph Smith had to lie about polygamy. That's leading people astray. Him lying about it publicly and then privately, like why wasn't he removed? Some would say he got killed, but like it is in the program. A lot of people have led people astray from the pulpit. Like even all the stuff they've rescinded from. I mean, look at all the stuff that Brigham Young taught that's no longer around with blood atonement, right? With polygamy, with united order, with what else is there, right?
Adam God
theory.
Goes on and on.
And the church has rescinded these publicly saying, nope, these are not correct. These are not doctrine, but the leaders of the church cannot lead you astray. And we're all just sitting here thinking, wait, what? How does that make sense?
Right. And actually the leader, the president of the church cannot lead you astray is so ironic in so many ways because it grew out of the polygamy crisis. And it was because Wilford Woodruff was contradicting what previous leaders had said, right? We have so many times of Brigham Young and John Taylor being on the record saying, if the church ever goes away from polygamy, you will know it is in apostasy. And this is absolutely essential for exaltation. So Wilford Woodruff was like, he had to set up some new, central doctrines, which I think are the temple and the idea that prophet can never lead you astray. He switched the focus from polygamy to
eternal sealings. The marriage.
Which have stayed with us.
Yeah.
Right. But it's so ironic that he was saying those previous leaders were wrong, but God wouldn't allow me to lead you astray. So stay with me. Right. And there really was a big split in the church that those who were like, no, we side with the last prophets left and went to formed the fundamentalist sect. And those who stayed were the rallying cry became the prophet cannot lead us astray. Right. And so it's an interesting thing to see that statement was necessary because prophets had led us astray. Right. And so it's, And
there was a lot of talk back then about, hey, the federal government can go shove it. We follow God only. And then years later, they're like, you know what? The federal government says we need to stop this. But actually, God told us we need to also, so it's okay, right? It's just, the federal government was leading the church back then. There's no question.
Although I think that Wilford Woodruff had genuine revelation from God that he was able to listen to. John Taylor, I think, would have let the church burn down around him out of his diligence to polygamy. He would have not let go of polygamy no matter what happened. Whereas Wilford Woodruff, because of the warning of the cursings that will come in the Book of Mormon, I tend to think that God was like, hey, are you willing to listen? Things are going to go really bad if you keep this up. So I think that even though it was compelled, I got some pushback from that. But even though it was compelled from Wilford Woodruff, I think at least stopping or at least lessening the practice of polygamy, they pulled down the endowment house, they stopped teaching it, and the numbers of polygamous marriages massively decreased, even with the first manifesto, and then more so with the second manifesto, right? So I see that as like when the Book of Mormon says it's better to repent when you're not forced, but even if you're forced, it's still repentance, right? Even a forced partial repentance, still the Lord blessed the people after that. The church wasn't destroyed like it would have been if they had continued. So that's how I see it.
The reason in the manifesto that's stated, if you read it very carefully, everyone should read it again. What were the reasons he gave for why we don't want to do this? And it was, we don't want to lose our temples. We don't want to lose our property.
Yeah.
It was about money. They didn't want to go bankrupt. They didn't want to lose assets because the federal government was threatening to seize assets, right? And so they're like, hey, we should stop because we we like the assets more than God's commandments, And so,
yeah.
I mean, if you read it with just an objective, take a step back. Why did they have to do this? It was because it was a corporation that was about to go under. It was about to go bankrupt.
And see, I think this is a good example. I'm glad we're having this conversation because I do think you have a more cynical perspective than I have in several of the things you've said, which that's not a criticism. I want people to pay attention and take notice that there are many different perspectives, and I'm not the one leading all of the perspectives, because when you say that that's what you read into the manifesto, I think that's there. But I also read into it that he's saying, is it better to stop all temple work? Like if we lose the temples, we lose the property. Yes, they would lose the property. But more so, I think I read his concern is we lose the ability to do any of our temple work. All of the men will be in prison.
Sure.
All of the leaders.
Yeah, but they did temple work long before the temples were ever built, like in a red brick store. They've done them out in the woods. You don't need a temple to do an endowment ceremony. That was never part of it, right?
Right, I mean, yeah. I hear you. I'm just pointing out the difference we see that I do see. I attribute more faith to that than I think you do. I think you are more cynical about it than I am, which is totally fine. Just, I want people to know there is a wide range of perspective on this topic.
Yeah. And honestly, that's what Hemlock Knots is about, is like providing a forum where people can come and explore this stuff, crack it open, see what other perspectives there are. It was never designed to be an instrument where I wanted to tell people what to believe, right? I never wanted to tell people what happened historically. I had no clue. In fact, I did a 2-part debate, and I didn't gather on any side. I was the moderator because I'm like, I'm not getting into this. But I had people present their different sides because I think the Hemlock Knots community that's the purpose of it. Come here and split some logs. Let's figure this out. Let's throw some sources at it. Let's crowdsource these questions and just do our best. And the community is super diverse. You don't find any two people that agree on 100%. Like, it's all over the place,
So we should point out, we're talking about the Facebook community, the group Hemlock Knots, which if you're not a member of, consider joining because it is valuable. And I would say, like, you have gone out of your way to make sure that is not an echo chamber. And I've been gratified to see how many actual trained historians have joined that group. That's been really, like...
I wish more would. I wish people would jump into the group and say, hey, I think this and this and this, even though it's unpopular in Facebook or in Hemlock Knots community, the Facebook. I think more people should come in and just guns blazing, cite your sources, tell us why you believe X or Y. If you think Joseph Smith was a polygamist, cool. Hit us with those sources. Let's get into the sources and let's convince people with logic instead of the Spirit told me, therefore I know, or just some sort of relative approach, right?
Right. We have a variety of problems. We have people that are just, I know this is true because it's threatening to me on one side or the other, or I have this conviction based on the worldview I have, but it's not based in actual sources and evidence. But then we also have this, I guess I would call it the arrogance of the standard narrative, which from my perspective, so far, the majority of even historians that I've encountered have generally approached this with appeal to authority and ad hominem. Yeah. Right. That's definitely what happens in the
default community. It's a default. Yeah.
It's like all of the historians agree you're not a trained historian and you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a flat earther. Therefore, we don't have to answer you.
Right. Yeah.
So I think Hemlock Knots is an incredible resource for historians who have, if you're a historian with that perspective, I think it's incredibly valuable to come to Hemlock Knots and say, okay, guys, this source I find like compelling. How do you guys ignore this source? Do you know about that? Like, I think even more than coming to Hemlock Knots to try to make your case, I would recommend to people to come and listen and learn for a little while, look up do some searches, inform yourself a little bit more if you can, or just come and inform yourself in the conversation and ask questions. I know that when Bill Reel was dealing with this topic and working on deeds, he joined Hemlock Knots and started, posing his questions.
And I loved seeing Bill Reel in there. I did. I was so glad that people like him came and participated, even though I understand that this group is very largely swayed towards Joseph is innocent, Joseph is infallible. Like, there's a lot of Joseph Smithites in there, and that's okay. But like, I'd like to balance it out a little bit more because I do know that this community is largely passionate about defending Joseph Smith, right? And so it's not always the most
right.
It's not always the most friendly environment, for dissuading opinions. Unfortunately, I'd like to change that one day.
Oh, I think I've been happy with a lot of people to see how the engagement has gone. I think it's a radioactive topic. People are deeply emotional about it. And from my perspective, a lot of people, well, yes, there is. I always want discourse to be better, to be less aggressive, less emotional, and more just informative. I'm always wanting that. But I think that Hemlock Knots often does really quite well. And, like compared to some of the other perspectives I've encountered in some of the other groups.
I think you do have quite a few people who do want to know what happened. They genuinely do. And if they're not quite there with their understanding it, they're still learning and stuff like that. But I think it's a good.
Yeah, and I guess
I wonder, what are our rules? One of our rules is that you have to ask a question with every post. And we did that intentionally because we don't like people drive-by preaching or coming in and, hey, here's this quote, choke on it. We want people to ask questions with every post because it forces, this is a discussion forum. This group is for discussing church history sources. And so don't come in with theology. Don't come in trying to prove the scriptures, say this and that. We just delete all those posts. This is the wrong group for that.
Right. And I will say I very, very rarely post any of my episodes in the group because I know that you explicitly didn't want it to become about my podcast or about, I only rarely, when there's a reason, hey guys, can you help me out with this? Or what do you think of, I would say once every 6 months, maybe, or I don't know, every 4 months. I'm trying to think.
You can do it as often as you want, as long as you follow the rules for posting.
Right. I just am wanting to let people know I've tried explicitly to not post there very much. I've tried not to take over that.
So you can post, I think just make it a discussion. It's hey, you can post on Hemlock Knots and say, hey, there's a new episode out. We're following this question. What do you guys think about X, Y, and Z? And start it. I don't mind you posting a link to your latest episode in there, but as long as you're trying to stimulate discussion. But if people,
that's good for me.
People come on a lot and they're like, hey, new episode link. And then they just post it. I'm like, no, it's going to be deleted. Right. It's nothing personal, but it's we got to keep that clean because I think our members really appreciate good focused posts that are about church history. They don't get into end times prophecy. They don't get into Bible verses. They don't, there's other groups for that. Right.
And it's just kind of a turnoff when it just becomes an advertisement thing. I don't love it when people just always come in and post their latest episode because they're trying to get views, so I guess I have also not wanted to do that for that reason as well. I really appreciate other people sharing my videos, but I definitely don't want to be hey guys, here I am, look at me,
I think start a discussion about what the episode's about. Start a discussion with a question, and then maybe in the post itself, or else in the comments, the first comment. Sometimes people will put a link in the comments. I'm totally good with that. There's no self-promotion there. In fact, our community does want to know about the topics you're presenting on, and so don't hold back. But just make sure you follow the rules because I have to be fair to everybody, including celebrities like yourself, right? So, and I have deleted a few of yours, Michelle. I'm sorry, but we just
have you.
We got to be fair.
I think maybe one.
It's because they didn't follow they got to follow the rules of posting, and everyone's you're so rigid. On you. You're so rigid on these rules.
Words about it. Yeah,
I think we did, but for the thousands of people's posts that I've deleted for the exact same reason, they didn't include a question. It wasn't about church history. It was self-promotion. I'm not saying yours was, but I have to be fair to everybody, including moderators. I've had posts deleted of my own, and I'm like, oh shoot, I forgot to, I forgot to follow the format. So
that's okay. That's good to know. I haven't felt like it's that was. I think I can't even remember what the reason was.
It was a while ago, year and a half maybe.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
It's probably because you didn't include a question.
I'm trying to remember because in my mind I'm thinking, I thought I followed all the rules and that you deleted. I think that's why I took issue with it because I was like, this was a bad decision, Mark. But I can't remember what it was, and I'm sure it was a good decision. So,
I think we worked on that though. I think you edited a few things and we let it go through, right? If I remember right.
I can't remember. I don't know. I might have taken my ball and gone home. That's
usually what we do.
There anymore.
I will usually send someone a message and say, hey, I'm not approving this yet, but if you want to edit it and make it into the right format of post, I'm happy to let it go through. I try to give people a warning,
Yeah, that's
I don't
good.
like
Okay.
deleting stuff usually. So
Yeah. I don't feel like it's moderated with a heavy hand, but I haven't been. I think I've only had one thing that wasn't allowed.
yeah.
So anyway, so okay, so I want to know. So your journey has been. I was super interested in this. I put up all of my resources. I tried to help people engage better with the sources and engage better with critical thought. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I wanted to make this additional point as well when we were talking about how people engage. And I will say that when people engage either with a lot of emotion or aggressively and with impatience for other people's views, and with just, I know this is true because I know it's true, it actually hurts rather than helps our cause. I think that allows people to underestimate how seriously we are taking the sources and how strong the actual evidence-based case for this topic is, because I don't feel like the people that are really working on this are like, I know I'm not coming into it from a position of God confirmed this to me, so I'm just going to keep preaching on it. I got here very slowly, kicking and screaming, realizing I would lose a lot of credibility by coming out on this topic, right? And I think that a lot of others feel that same way. So I would invite people to try to engage in, I want people on our end of this argument to try to elevate the discourse and hope that other people can start catching up.
Totally. Yeah. And you said our end of the argument. So like you've got this conclusion over here, this conclusion over here. I want more people to realize, hey, this is a complicated issue and there's shades of gray between. It's okay to belong in the shades of gray. Totally cool to say, I don't really know what happened, but I'm leaning towards this, if I had to guess. Like, that's okay. And I wish the official church historians and the narrative, I wish they would be softer with some of their claims, because that's really where they get into a lot of trouble, is they're like, I declare by the Holy Spirit that this and this happened. And it's like, yeah, but like, what about all this that says it didn't? And so I think a lot more of us, I would like to see a lot more people recognize that these issues are super complicated. They're hard to determine, and it's okay to be in the middle somewhere. And it's okay to be over here and then be over here now. It's okay. We reserve the right to change our mind, right? And so
absolutely. I hope we're all doing that. I hope we're all changing our mind often on it.
We should be. If we're learning, we should be adapting our views as we go. So
right. And even if it's strengthening our perspective and strengthening our views, because we should be always learning. I don't like it to be, oh, I just saw this piece, so now I think this. Oh, I saw this piece, now I think this. I sometimes have people that engage with me like that, and it's frustrating when it's like, I was totally on board, but I saw this one piece of evidence, and now I'm totally on board here. And, I think we should be a little bit more patient to form firm conclusions and a little more humble in our conclusions. Mm-hmm. And at least, I know that sometimes when I've seen something that I'm like, oh my gosh, what does that mean? How do I make sense of that? And I've done this long enough to know that when I dig in deeper, there are usually answers and things that come about that go, oh, that explains it. Okay, now that makes sense. But I think that at least being willing to consider the challenges to a perspective is really important, so that I hope that more and more people will do that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. We try to take a more objective approach when we can. Is it okay if I share a screen real quick and just kind of show you one small example of what we're trying to do in this community? So Louisa Beeman, supposedly one of Joseph Smith's wives, right? We try to just break it down with little tidbits, really easy to understand stuff. Here's the dates, here's all 6 of the sources for this, 3/4 of these firsthand accounts. So we just break it down by where's the quality of the source material behind this story? And if you get stuff in the yellow and the green, it's probably a little bit more believable if there's multiple sources that were there and they said it, buck them out. And so, but some of these stories, if we can take a look at where did these sources actually come from? You don't have to argue about who do you believe more, Emma or, Eliza Snow. Like, it doesn't have to be about that. Let's just go with like, okay, when were these things said? Under what circumstances? What did the person have to gain from it? How did they know about it? Where was it first recorded? How much longer after the fact that he said it? And is it even possible to remember that level of detail 10 years later? No. And so we try to just give people as close to an objective. Now, not in the Facebook group. There's a lot of subjective and emotions behind that stuff, those posts. But on the website itself, like, just come here and freshen up on some of the sources and wrap your head around a topic first. And then we think that makes you a lot better at actually discussing it and seeing the complexities of it, right?
That's great. This is so useful. And so what are some of the sources on your website that you would want people to know about? I really think that this is so helpful. So how many of the wives do you have this kind of a timeline about?
I didn't do that for very many. I started, but it's just such a big undertaking. But look at Fanny Alger, whatever.
I say Alger.
Yeah. And so take a look at, like, here's the timeline of like everything that I was able to find about her. It's here. And it's sorted by date. Fabulous. So you can see, like, where did it start? And William McClellan writes a letter. He wrote that letter 34 years later. I'm going to highlight that because that's important.
And William McClellan is a terrible, hostile source, right? Do you include who he is and what he did?
Well, William McClellan excommunicated for, right here. So I try to include the entire story. What was going on? What was going on just a few weeks before he writes this salacious letter about Joseph? He was in a church excommunication trial, and he's trying to get someone else to look like a pervert. So I think he's just,
He also was the one, he robbed Emma while Joseph was in prison, at least according to the sources that were printed in the newspaper. And and according to that same source, he wanted to beat up Joseph while he was basically in his chains. Right. So definitely not someone that Emma would open up to. Okay.
And so we get to here and it's like, okay, let me summarize this all for you. Right. Yeah. And what are some of the opinions out there of the LDS Church? Fragmentary evidence suggests. Okay. Real certain, aren't we, historians? Mm-hmm. So they're just like stabbing at it. They need this thing to be true, but they know they can't prove it. And so pay attention to what the people are saying. Right. Even Brian Hales, who's very well respected on the subject of Joseph's polygamy, and I tip my hat to Brian Hales. I think he's a thorough researcher. Even though I don't always agree with the conclusions, I think he's put in the time and the effort to study the topics, and for that, I will always respect someone who's studied the topics, regardless of their conclusion. I think they're better off than people who ignorantly pick a side.
Well, I agree with you on the context. I mean, on terms of him providing sources, I think that work he's done has been invaluable. But I am embarking on, people who watch my channel know that he is the opposite of a transparenciist. So I feel like he is actually not an honest actor, and that's troubling to me. Maybe. I appreciate the sources he does provide, but I don't appreciate the deception that I believe he's engaged in.
And that's fair enough. But that's a personal thing. But, he did write a three-volume set, and there are footnotes in it. And so that does help people to get back to the sources. And he's even admitting in this particular instance, like, hey, there's no contemporaneous records that have been located about the story. Well, shouldn't that read, let's not say it's true until we do find something solid,
right?
So
we have no evidence to claim this is true, right?
That's my only beef. And so the only earliest accounts we have are secondhand, and they're within 9 years after it happened. So like, do we really want to claim that this definitely happened? And so this is an example of one of many things. Polygamy, timeline of events. We've got, you can sort here and just, there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, it's long. It even gets into the modern times where you've got like DNA studies. Right.
Oh, great.
Hugo Perego in 2016, what were the results of the DNA test? Like, the entire topic is, well, not the entire, but the overwhelming majority of the sources are here as far as the major timeline of events in the story. Can't include everything, but most of the relevant, hard-hitting stuff is here on both sides. There's some pro and against stuff all mixed into one. So I think it's a good source for people to start with, and then they can make their conclusions when they're more familiar with that.
That's great. And one thing I also have appreciated is your list of scriptures that you have. I used to double check on that to make sure I wasn't missing any, because I had my own list of scriptures, but it's so useful to be able to compare and look, make sure you've got everything. I have things that you don't necessarily have, but there would be times that you would have something that I didn't have. So
totally.
Really
and
helpful.
So there's also that. And then a list of who are they in the scriptures? Who are these people?
Who are the polygamists and monogamists?
These are the monogamists, according to scripture.
Right. Mm-hmm.
These are the ones who participated in polygamy. Just take a look at some of these guys, like these wicked kings of,
we've got
Israel. These guys were not upstanding folks, but you look at like Lemuel, Nephi, Sam, Jacob, Zoram, King Benjamin's people, King Lamoni, right? Lehi, Moses, Lot. I don't know. It's just like, let's just separate it out. Why would God tell Abraham to do it to get to heaven, and yet tell Noah that, hey, if you do this, you're going to hell? Like, I don't think that's really a consistent story. So I'm just trying to pinpoint some of the ironies in the story and give people a place to go. So I didn't really go into a lot of the other topics, but here's one about tithing. I think this is a big deal. Tithing has changed a lot since the very beginning.
Oh, that's great.
And this is hard hitting. It's not for the faint of heart, but if you decide not to pay tithing after reading this, that's on you. Don't blame me. All right. But it just shows that in Joseph Smith's day, what they were doing for tithing was not the same as what we do today. It was never meant to be 10% of your income. That's ridiculous. That's a federal government move with taxes. Right. So, but it was just you would give Bishop Partridge was saying 2% of your
excess,
2% of your excess, one-time payment. When you join the church, you give 2% of your excess, and then you're done the rest of your life. That's how it started out. Imagine how many, families could not be in poverty if they just were to understand that they don't need to keep paying for the long-term investments of the church that already has trillions of dollars, and they could do better to provide for their families if they could just imagine someone putting 10% of their income into an investment account or a retirement account instead. Everybody would retire millionaires,
I was going to do a topic on, an episode on tithing, but I decided not to because it just doesn't fit in with what I'm trying to do well enough. So I'm glad you have this here. But I always tell people, always it's between you and God. Make the best decision with you and God rather than listening to, any outside sources.
Yeah. And if you want to give back to the organization that you get so much from, I have no problem with tithing as a whole. It's
or if
okay.
you feel spiritually led to do that, because it should be a spiritual principle. That's the only reason you should pay anyway, is because you feel inspired to, right?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with tithing in and of itself, but to say something like you're not going to see your children or your wife again after this life unless you pay us 10% of your income, that's where I have a problem with this teaching that's gone off the rails, right? It's just not. It's just not how it's supposed to be.
Yep. Oh, that's so great. And thanks for giving us that overview of the website. Are you done sharing it? So, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, I really appreciate that. And I really do hope people are willing to pay attention to this conversation to see how broad and diverse the community of, I don't even know what we are called, the community of people who are critical of the Joseph Smith polygamy narrative. We need a better term than that. But people who think that there is reason to research this, it is a varied, broad, wide community with a lot of diversity. And I would never claim to be. I'm thankful that I've been able to do what I've done and that I've become a voice in this community. But I certainly wouldn't. I don't think we have a leader. Right?
I don't think so. And people are like, wow, there's this new movement popping up where people think Joseph Smith was not. And it's like, what are you kidding me? Read the church history. This was a massive debate while Joseph was alive, whether or not he was involved in this stuff. There were trials. There were court cases. There were, excommunication trials. There were. This was a big deal back then. And so it's more like we forgot about it for a while. And then it's coming back again now that the internet's a big deal and there's a lot of research tools available that aren't before. Nobody had time to go down to the church history vaults and look at microfiche for 29 hours looking for something. Nobody does that, right? So now it's easier.
Historians and yeah, it's so much easier. And I think that we've had this challenge of people thinking this was resolved. this is an old RLDS narrative. And now even the RLDS church has admitted that they're not, I think that the RLDS church changing on this did a lot of damage to the ability to have a viable conversation on this topic. But I hope that people who haven't watched my RLDS episode yet will go watch it. I'll link it below, because it is the wrong. People assume that they changed their stance because of overwhelming evidence. That could not be further from the truth. They were motivated to step away from Joseph Smith. That's what they were trying to do at that period. So they found some things they could use to justify saying, we're not going to claim this anymore. We're going to be agnostic on the question. And it's really important for people to understand that, because that's when and luckily the Prices came out of that and started to take up the torch. So that's where we get Joseph Smith fought polygamy. But I think it's important for people to recognize that this question has never gone away. It's never been resolved. Pretty much every time it's been tried in a court of law. I'm trying to think back through Joseph Smith's life. But yes, I think I can say every single time it's been officially tried in a court of law, Joseph has been found to be innocent.
The Temple Law case, the biggest one, it's a huge thing. Judge Phillips made a ruling at the end after all of it. He's like, look, I don't know what happened, but we're not buying it.
I don't believe you guys. Yeah, I don't believe the testimonies. Right.
And it was the court case was trying to settle the question of what they're practicing in Utah. Was it the same doctrinally as what was taught by Joseph Smith? And the ruling was nope. Totally new church in Utah. Totally different teachings. Right. They don't have a lot of origin in Joseph Smith. So, I mean, that took couple years, right? All the hearings and it was a big deal. And there were hard-hitting lawyers on both sides trying to get all this evidence. And the Utah folks are scrambling to write books of affidavits to try to prop up evidence that they didn't have for 30 years. And so,
I think we should acknowledge that was done when most of the wives were alive.
They were still alive, and they were still, the jury didn't believe them.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It was argued the best it possibly could be. They had firsthand accounts of eyewitness testimonies who were claiming to be married to Joseph Smith, making their case.
And when they were cross-examined, they fell apart. You read through and these people did not know what to say. It's almost like some of them were given a script, I think, of here's what you need to say in court. But when they were cross-examined and put on the spot, I think they just they fell apart because it wasn't real experience they were drawing upon. They were trying to create a narrative. To save the property. It's about keeping the temples, just like Wilford Woodruff. Well,
and I think that they genuinely had been steeped for decades in this idea of build the kingdom. God needs you to say this, right? It was such a hierarchy, and this is what has to be the narrative to protect the kingdom of God. So I think many of them felt that obligation and also the resentment of who are you, stupid government, to question my view of God, right? That comes through a lot in a lot of this testimony. And so with some of them, when you read it, you actually kind of feel embarrassed for them. Some of the women in particular, you're like, oh my gosh, this is just
brutal.
Embarrassing.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel bad for
and
them.
then there are some of the men like Joseph Bates Noble, I think it is, that you're just like, oh my gosh, you are a nut job and I would not want to live next door to you.
He is the funniest guy in church history. He's my favorite.
But we're not laughing with him. We're laughing at him, right?
He's just a hilarious dude. He's just so funny. Anyway, So a lot of these questions have already been dragged out into the limelight hundreds of years ago, over 100 years ago. This thing is not new. There's no new resurgence of anyone trying to prove any. And I think there's people who are like, oh, this is an old RLDS narrative. It's not it's an old LDS narrative. There were debates within the church in the 1830s of whether or not polygamy was a thing. And every record we have that's contemporary, firsthand from Joseph, period. I've got 9 of them so far. No, he's against it.
I think there are a lot more. Yeah, there are a lot more than that, I think.
If you don't include all the scriptures that he helped produce, the Joseph Smith translation, the Book of Mormon, in the scriptures, the Doctrine and Covenants is against polygamy, except for 132. That's the only one.
Right.
It's an outlier.
Yep, I really do. That's what I think is so interesting. The more and more I research, the more confidence I get that eventually this narrative is going to completely change. Because the very best you can say, I would say, I liked your idea that the church could become somewhat agnostic, as the RLDS church did. The Community of Christ now is agnostic.
It's also called honesty.
Right.
Because they don't know what happened.
Case you can make. Right. I think the best case you can make is there is controversy on this topic. Some sources claim that Joseph was a polygamist. Some sources, including all of the sources from Joseph Smith himself, claim that he was not.
Yes.
People are free to study it out and form their own conclusions.
And the church could say that the scriptures are strongly against polygamy, except for D&C 132, which was not published until 1867, by the way.
Oh, it was
published in the scriptures. In the scriptures, it wasn't.
In the scriptures, it wasn't until 1880. Orson Scott was assigned to put it together in 1876. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's pretty important to recognize that Section 101, the Statement on Marriage, was in scriptures during almost the entire polygamous period of the church.
And a year later, 1881, fun fact, was the first time that Fanny Alger's name was ever mentioned in any of the records.
Really? It wasn't until 1881?
Even Brian, I got that one from Brian Hales. He talked about it. Yeah, so 1881 was the first time that her actual name was attributed to the girl business story back in,
Wow. Okay. I haven't yet done my episodes on
it. Took them that long to put a name to the face.
And that's how hard they were looking. They dug back.
Well, and Fanny Alger's brother was with the Saints in Utah the whole time. Didn't say a word.
Say, hey, by the way.
No idea. He's like, oh, this is news to me. Like, I don't know. We just don't have much about it. So if you take an objective look, you stand back, get rid of the emotion, get rid of, hey, I don't want to do this because my family might disown me, or I might lose my job or recommend, or whatever the fears are, strip those away, stand back and just look at the story and be like, huh, interesting. There's some weirdness here.
Right.
Maybe we shouldn't declare definitively unless we know definitively, right?
I love it. And that's what I think. I think that what does absolutely emerge is the desperate need of the Utah polygamist Mormons to claim that Joseph was a polygamist. And that is where we get the entire evidence base of his polygamy, is from that period when we know they were altering documents and manufacturing evidence. That does absolutely emerge. Then people can decide how credible they think those sources to be. But I think that's because then the other piece that we have is the what the Doctrine and Covenants calls the testimony of traitors, the contemporaneous accusations of John Bennett, of William Law, right? That's the other piece that needs to be looked into. But how much correlation is there between the two? Anyway, it's a really interesting topic that I think is worthy of investigation.
Yeah. So, and for the record, I don't know what happened. I'm not joining either camp. I lean towards most of the evidence that says that he was a polygamist and was involved. It is way worse in quality than the stuff that he's coming out and saying, no, like it's an abomination. Anyone caught doing this is going to be excommunicated. Like that stuff is like firsthand, contemporary. It's good sources. But the other stuff is it just doesn't hold the same weight as far as quality. And that's why I lean towards, probably not. I think there was probably some foul play. I think Brigham Young and company, they needed to pin the tail on the donkey with Joseph being the source of it, because they were hell-bent to do it. And they wanted him to get on board, probably. I don't know. They needed to tie back to Joseph's church, even though most people don't know that in February 1851, Brigham Young incorporated a brand new church, new legal entity, separate name from the church. Like legally, those are two different churches. Okay. Yes. It's a brand new church as of 1851. People have no idea that legally Brigham Young set up a brand new entity that he could be the trustee over, because he tried to get the temple lot and he tried to get the Nauvoo temple sold, and he couldn't because he wasn't on the title and he wasn't the trustee and he had no power. And so what does he do? He starts he's like, screw it. I'm going to start a brand new church with a different name, and I'm going to say that I'm part of that. And that goes to the temple lot case. And the judge is like, yeah, you have nothing to do with Joseph's church. Like, you all are left field. And so people don't realize there's two separate legal entities. It's like having two different trusts. Like, you can't claim they're the same because they're different, and they're different signatures and different names and different, whatever else.
Different controlling authorities over them. Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know that. That's so, and then they
There's
come
a
to
lot
Utah
of
and
stuff
they
out there,
baptize
yeah.
everybody, right?
They got rebaptized because they weren't yet baptized into the new church. Yes.
Yeah,
And so
that's
if you take a step back and look at it, go, I see what happened. That makes a lot. And actually, it makes a lot of sense because I spent years just like agonizing. How can this be? Like, that's impossible, you know? But if you take a step back and human nature, I see what happened there. Businessmen doing what men do. And I know why they did it.
I get problems of the day.
I get why they did it, but there's 132 problems behind every claim, right?
That's right. So final question, and I don't know where this question will go, but I want to know because I get frustrated by the claims on both sides saying, if you think this, you have to leave the church. So we have the people that are in the church saying, you can't talk about this because it will make everyone leave the church, right? And then we have people who are outside of the church saying, how can you, you're not being consistent in your claims. I just want to know how you see this topic. Do you see it as the end of the possibility for faith and activity? Or I don't have faith in the church. That's not where my faith is. But activity in the church and finding value in the church and finding connection to God in the church and finding feeling compelled to stay in the church. Do you think that is not viable, not possible, and not intellectually honest?
It just depends. It depends on where you are. So I know a lot of people that still participate in church. They still enjoy it. Like I've gone several times in the last couple of years, and it's not a big deal. I don't lose my mind. I just don't. Some of the core teachings. I hear it over the pulpit, and I say, oh, whatever. Like it's okay. Like I'm not threatened by it. It doesn't. You don't have to believe everything you hear at church, right? You also don't have to disbelieve it. I mean, there's some good stuff in there mixed in. So I think the better we are at separating all that as far as getting our ideals and our values from it, the better off we'll be. And if you want to belong to it for the social reasons, that's fine too. My kids go to church, my two boys, that's okay. I baptized both of them in the church, even though the bishop interviewed me and asked about my priesthood, and I said, I don't have any. And so they still let me, so
okay.
So there's little things like that where, I don't know. It's okay. If my boys want to go on missions, cool. I'll pat them on the back. I'll help them get there. And, I went on a mission. I don't have any regrets for it. I'm not trying to stop anybody else from doing it, but I think people do need to make the decision themselves and not be pressured by family or bishops or whoever. I think more people should step up to the plate and take responsibility for their faith and their choices and their activities and why they do what they do. As long as people are doing that and they're fully committed, I say, awesome.
Okay.
Have a reason to believe, like Paul says, have a reason to believe what you do. And I think that's what I'm after. I'd like more people to do that, but that's just my opinion.
Yep, I like that. And I do want to just also share my perspective. I know I say it a lot, but I actually really want people to stay in full activity in the church as much as possible because I think it's so valuable, not even as a go in and change the church. I just think that, I think the church is such a blessing to us. And I really actually am a big believer in that, the Lord's invitation to repent is always there for all of us, which just means change our mind on some things, right? I have great hope for the church. And I actually really love so much about the church and find so much value there and so much truth and so much hope. And I do think that I think that the restoration is absolutely kept alive in the church from my perspective. So this is my last very self-serving question, and then I'll let you say anything you want.
Yeah.
So Mark, for all of these people claiming that I am single-handedly leading people out of the church on this topic, how much of a role did I and my podcast play in your journey on this topic and your journey with your activity in the church?
I don't think any. I mean, I watch a lot of your episodes and you do some good research and I appreciate that. But I also watch stuff from Brian Hales or whoever. I watch both sides because I think that's helpful. Right. But, my decisions personally didn't have anything to do with you or anybody, really, Okay.
And you had already formed you had already come to where you were before I even started my podcast, is my understanding, right?
Yeah, it was an evolution. I was on my way to that, and you were certainly helpful. I got to give credit to you as well as my moderators on Hemlock Knots, like Peter Brown, right? Dustin Grady, Jessica Long, Jeremy, all these guys that helped me moderate, and then all the community, my timeline and my website was basically putting together a bunch of stuff that other people sent me. Other people pointed me to this. So I had a ton of help. I don't want to take credit for Hemlock Knots other than I was the guy that sat down and coded the website and put it up. That's basically it. I started these groups, but like the community is running the show right now. And they deserve the credit because they are the researchers who helped me put stuff on the timeline. And I just was data entry, basically, you know. I
love that. So it really has been a collaborative effort.
Totally. It's a huge community. Yeah. And you know what? I mean, I've got books right here that I've got sources from. I go to this and these guys were hugely helpful in my journey as well. There's good, valuable stuff in there for anyone wanting to learn all sides of it. And I recommend you don't jump into a camp and just be black or white. It's not, Dodgers versus Yankees here. Like, we're all just trying to play baseball, which is the sport of like trying to figure out what happened. And so it doesn't matter what team you're on, just keep learning, keep practicing. And so I think any sources cited is a good thing, but take it one step further. Okay, there's a source here. What's the quality of the source? Where did the source come from? So keep digging. Don't just give up. Oh, so-and-so said it, I believe it. Question solved. It's over.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Sources are everything. The quality of the source. Where does it come from?
Quality of the source. There's some bad sources out there. Yeah. Weed them out, or at least demote them on their credibility. Put them last on the list of reasons to believe,
And do you know what? I love that really objective, quantifiable way you have laid it out so people can see, am I prioritizing this source out of motivated reasoning or because it warrants it? It deserves to be prioritized, right? I think that's a really good thing for people to say, where does this source objectively lie and how am I using it? I think that's a good exercise for everyone to go through.
Totally. So I think so. That's what I'm trying to do is to help people have resources where they can better study without spending hours and hours digging through stuff. And so, but like at Hemlock Knots, like we don't really care what you believe. Like you believe whatever you want, but like if you want to discuss the sources behind your beliefs, like then that's a good place to go, I think, in regards to church history.
That's great. And then and I appreciate you saying, I appreciate that you like enjoy my podcast or have gained value from it because totally. That really is a compliment to me because of all of the work that you've already done. But I do want to also set the record straight. I'm so frustrated by all of the people saying that I am leaving people out of the church. I think that the more true statement is this topic is messy for the church, right? This topic, polygamy and Joseph's polygamy, has been something that has been leading people out of the church from the very beginning. Just like you talked about in 1844, we had a huge succession crisis and people went all different directions. And that continued when the RLDS missionaries came here. They've gained many, many converts in Utah by saying, hey, Joseph didn't do this, right? So if there is some threat to the institutional church, it is from the narrative. It's from the historical record of what happened. And so that's what I want to keep telling people. Like Mountain Meadows Massacre is a really challenging topic for the church narrative. So the question is, who's to blame? Fawn Brody not Fawn Brody. Who was it? Juanita Brooks for talking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and bringing it out of the shadows, or the people who committed the murders, right? I think that it's really important to recognize that people like Mark or people like me that are helping, or even people like Brian Hales, because his narrative has led many, many people out of the church. His book.
Totally. Yeah.
And it's not people talking about it that's the problem. It's just that it's a big, messy, difficult part of our history that deserves to be dealt with honestly, without fear and without the motivation.
Totally. And the official story is that Joseph Smith lied. Everybody else after that was honest. And so is that going to help keep people in the church? I don't know. Like you're throwing your founder under the bus so that the number 2 guy in charge can maintain his credibility. Like, it's just weird.
How does that work? It is. And it's worse even than he lied. It's that he was I mean, they call him a pedophile. And I mean, if these stories were all true, then he really is manipulating young girls using his power. And it's a terrible, terrible story, which is why your stepson fell in so deep, right? Like the CES letter does so much damage to people because we tell the same story. We tell the same narrative. Just in our version, God made him do it. So we throw God under the bus in our version.
Yeah, and then we wonder why the missionary efforts are struggling these days and why it's so hard for missionaries to get people to actually pay attention.
Right.
I think it's kind of like if you've got personal issues and trauma from your past and you made mistakes in your life, like you can sweep them under the rug and you can gaslight everybody the rest of your life and say nothing happened here, or you can just bring them out, be honest about it, and just be authentic. And I think that is where I think a lot of people would actually have a positive view of the church, is if they could deal with taking out the trash appropriately. Even if they made mistakes, who cares? But lying about it and calling people crazy and kicking them out of your congregation if they're struggling with this, like that, I think is doing way more damage than them actually being like, if they were to come out with a press release tomorrow and say, we fully understand that our history has been pockmarked with bad decisions by some of the leaders, inconsistent statements, with mistakes were made, and if they were just to say, but today we want to move past that. This is what we stand for today. We want honesty and transparency. We want people to know the doctrine of Christ as taught in the scriptures. We want our leaders to be in alignment with what God taught in the scriptures. And we are committed moving forward to have a church that can provide that for the families out there, as well as the fellowship and the service opportunities. Like, can you imagine reading that on the front page of Deseret News? Like, I would be like, yes, thank you. Like my opinion of the church is now way more than it was, because instead of just hiding it and gaslighting every single person who tries to bring this into the limelight, it just doesn't work. It's bad therapy. And it's, someone once described it as institutional narcissism. And it's kind of the same thing where like, it is. And it's really sad. I think they need to get away from the mental illness of trying to keep this organization's record clean, because nobody's buying it anymore. Everyone knows there's problems. 132 problems is the name of your channel. Like, there's problems here. And so dismissing them is no longer a valid solution, I think. Just be honest.
Oh, my gosh. When you were saying that, I just got chills. It's given me a whole new thing to hope for. I think that is
People would be like, good for you, incredible. Church leaders, incredible. You guys did something that nobody could do for 180 years or whatever it was. I'm not sure how long it's been, but anyway, I think that would be refreshing. It's sort of like when you know someone's lying and someone steps up and say, you know what, you're right. There are some inconsistencies here. We're going to deal with it. We're going to make the best of it, even though it's a public relations nightmare. We are committed to being transparent.
Right. And you know what? Just like you're saying, it's much less of a public relations nightmare than the current state of affairs. This is a public relations nightmare.
It is a nightmare. Yeah. So I studied public relations in college. I'm in corporate marketing as my career. This is a can of worms.
It's the worst.
I would want this to go away if I was in charge of the public relations of the church. But there's only one way to do it, and that's just be honest with the people.
The word is repentance. That's the word. It's like we can practice what we preach. That's like step one of repentance, acknowledgement, right? Then just apologize for the mistakes and set a new course going forward. Turn away from the mistakes of the past. Totally. That's all it is.
And we don't blame Russell M. Nelson for what Brigham Young did. It's not his fault. I think people will be a little more understanding. But he needs to make the distinction between like, hey, this stuff was an error. However, we still stand for the good stuff. I think you just have to do it that way. And I'm frustrated with the church mostly because of the deception and the lying and how they treat people who bring up issues that are trying to help the church to become clean with their history.
That is such a good point right there. People aren't leaving because of the history. People are leaving because of the
lying, the lying and the deception and the rewriting of history. That was a nail in the coffin for me. The fact that they had to rewrite history again in the Saints Volume 1 and 2, like, come on, guys. That's not going to do anything.
Okay, so that was your final Okay.
I mean, it was when I saw how the narrative had changed over time, I'm like, oh, I know what's happening here and it ain't good. Like, this is not, if one of my family members were to do this with my history, like I'd be pissed.
Yeah.
Right. Like, like this is deception. And it's not just the errors, mistakes were made, whatever. Like, this is intentional whitewashing of history. And I think that seems a lot darker than someone just coming forth and be like, yeah, it's kind of messy, but we're going to try to clean it up. Don't let that get you hung up on, there's other ways to navigate it. We're just not seeing those publicly.
Oh my gosh.
You're seeing like CES teachers being fired for bringing up these things in the classroom and trying to explain the complexity of situations. Like, what is this like?
And people having to fight for their membership. Like, how many people are out there calling for my excommunication, including Brian Hales? Like, or I guess we don't call it that way. We've used a euphemism. What is it, like revocation of membership or end of membership privileges, whatever we call it now? It's still
PR spin. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And to have people, I think that is the nightmare they're facing, where anyone who watches me, for example, or who delves into your sources and your website and watches your episodes, it's so clear that all we are trying to do is get into the evidence and find truth. That's abundantly clear to everyone. So it puts the church, it puts Brian Hales and people pushing that narrative into a terrible position where if they excommunicate us for just trying to get to the truth, it makes it that much more obvious what they are doing, which is lying to protect a narrative, which is what their PR disaster actually is. I think that your PR expertise and the way that you just promoted going about that is like the most refreshing version I have heard. I hope that people will listen and pay attention.
Thanks. I mean, they won't, because there will be a huge fallout. I mean, not everybody will respond positively to it, but at least
right. But you know what?
They'll know that we dealt with it.
I have an episode that I wanted to release a while ago. I've been distracted with so many things, but it's called A Way Forward, which is proposing some things that the church could do. And I'm glad I haven't recorded yet, because I want to include some of what we talked about. But what I have said, or what I am saying in this episode, is look at what has happened every time the church has repented, which just means changed a bad policy, whether they fully acknowledge it or not. In 1904, when the church actually went away from polygamy, or even 1890, church growth up until that point had been very stagnant, very slow. Polygamy was killing the growth of the church. Any advantage people want to claim that might have come through having more babies through polygamy, which actually didn't happen, was more than counterbalanced by the lack of converts during that period. But as soon as they repented of that and stopped polygamy, the growth through the 20th century was profound, up until we bumped up again to racism, right? And so then the church growth stagnated. The church started getting all kinds of terrible PR because of our racist policy. The church did the unthinkable and changed that. Both of those things were unthinkable to change. The fallout was immense. They were actual practices, right? But once that changed, the growth of the church through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s was unprecedented, right? So that's what I'm trying to propose. While there may be some pushback and some fallout, changing this now, stepping away from polygamy, which we're not even practicing now, would be far easier than it was in 1890, 1904, far easier than changing the racist ban of 1978. Right. But we could expect a similar thing to happen. Right now, the church is just drowning in bad PR, and our membership is really dwindling, and our missionary efforts are dwindling as well. Yeah. But I think that if we were to take this step of, again, repenting, and like you said, being actually transparent and actually honest about our history, I can't imagine what would happen with the growth of the church, because there's so much to offer if they'll just stop lying to us.
And stop throwing God under the bus. People lose their faith in God and Jesus when they come out and say, like the priesthood in 1978, right? The priesthood ban lifted. So they come out and say, we received a new revelation. God's now okay with black people having the priesthood. And everyone's like, yay. But the rest of the world's like, what? Like, you're blaming God for this? Well, now, if they would have come out and said this instead, here's the PR training. What if this came out instead? As a church, we've realized that prior generations of leadership, whether it was culturally or just a personal bias or bigotry, They initiated policies that were not commandments from God. They were just policies derived from well-meaning men. But we realize now that those were done in error, and we deeply apologize to the African American community. But as a church, we now want to move forward with everybody having equal rights to the priesthood. And we apologize for the actions of prior leadership. And we believe that this is the way that God would have us do that now. You're not saying you got a revelation. You're not blaming God for like, they're not ready yet. Oh, now they're ready. Like that did more damage, the little twist and the manipulation that was attached to that story. They should have just come out and said, look, we screwed up. People that lived a long time ago, they had their biases. We're really sorry. We value everybody, including African Americans. We want everybody in the church to be equal. Like that would be a positive message that everyone would be like, cool, no problem.
Right. Right. And you know what? It would have also, especially if they had been able to say, like, this was a mistake, like you said.
Yeah.
And we value all of, like, God loves all of his children, and we value the African American communities, and we are redoubling our efforts to try to do the good that we can in those communities through missionary efforts and also through charitable efforts, right? Like, I think that to actually embrace that community would have been amazing. And so, but I guess the point I'm making, even just like in 1890 and 1904, even the partial half steps at repentance still bore good fruit, right? It's still better that we got rid of the priesthood ban.
Better than nothing.
It's better. Even though the bad way we did it has made that problem continue, the church still has a lot of racism. Like talking to Marvin Perkins or other Black members of the church or members of the Church of African descent still are frustrated by how hard it is to engage with our church because of how much leftover bad perspective there is there. So we need to do better. And so
and you can't fix what was done in the past as far as the church making blunders with PR issues. But moving forward, I think they would be wiser to take an objective, like honest approach of what really happened. You know, people would resonate with that better, I think.
100%. I love it. And I'm politicians, when they make mistakes, or corporate officers that make horrendous mistakes, their PR people say to them, you go in front of the camera, you admit you did wrong, you apologize, and we put it to rest. And that's what politicians do. We are trained in the PR industry to, hey, accountability is the best way out here, buddy. You get squirrely on camera, you make excuses, the media is going to fillet you. We always know that. The mistake isn't the problem. The lying about the mistake is the problem.
Just own it. It's okay that you broke the glass jar, little kid, in the kitchen. Just don't blame your little brother for it. You know? Yeah. Don't blame it on God. Just clean it up. Yeah.
Don't blame God.
Admit it. Yeah. No big deal, right? We still love you.
So, okay. I'm like, can we start a campaign, Mark, for church PR?
No, you don't want that.
But
the first thing I would do is give everybody their tithing back. You don't want that. So.
Okay, never mind. Not for church PR. Just listen to what he's saying. But this has been so productive and so valuable. I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else you want to?
No, thank you. This has gone pretty long, but thank you for having me on, and thanks for being open to some of the crazy ideas that come from others. I think you do a good job of like letting lots of voices on the show, and for that, I tip my hat to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. And thank you for all of the incredible work you have done. You have done a lot to move this all forward. I hope that more and more voices that are interested in this topic will join Hemlock Knots and engage in productive ways. I think it's so useful. I love the historians that are there. I hope
we're just talking about stuff.
Right. Any polygamists or any people that just think that are just members of the church that think we should not be talking about this, go ahead and join, and maybe you'll be able to make your point, or maybe you'll be able to understand why people think we should be talking about it.
And for people already in the Hemlock Knots community, like I really hope that they'll be kind to people who show up, have different views. Like, please be nice to each other. Like, I want the community to be healthy. I want it to be like respectful. So like, I don't like some of the stuff that I see occasionally with like us versus them and these big heated debates. And I know it's going to happen, and I'm stirring the pot by just creating the channel, but like, hopefully we can look past the differences and just focus on like, okay, let's all try to learn from this thing. Whatever your conclusions are, nobody cares. We'll respect them, right? let them worship how, when, what they may. Isn't that what we claim? Articles of faith, right?
Yep. And I do want to always
Let's live that.
understand people have been triggered and damaged by these topics. So for a lot of people, there is a lot of hurt, and that shows up in some of the ways that people engage on both sides. So I think on every side, like, let's all try to take a couple of deep breaths, give it a half hour before you respond to something, right? And then if you see someone responding in a triggered state, try to also be compassionate and patient with that and understand where that's coming from. And that's how I think we all can work to get things better and better as we engage, which I think is what we're all hoping for. So
and if you read something on there that you don't agree with, someone's comment, you don't have to respond. It's all right. It's okay to just be like, to each their own. It's all right.
Yeah.
It won't change anything about you.
I don't like it.
Or an angry face, or whatever. But you don't have to respond and berate them. I mean, that's all right. So
perfect. Well, my gosh, this has been such a good conversation. I'm really glad we finally got an official recorded conversation. We've had some great ones that have been informal, but I'm looking forward to continuing to engage. And I do hope that people will use the website, go to the Facebook group, watch the debates. You know what? I've been wanting to do some future debates. So maybe I'll tap you and see if you have even enough interest in the topic to be involved.
I like the format. Like, I think both sides of the debates had some really, really good stuff. And I was hoping for that. I think both sides presented really, really well. They did their research. And so that was a win.
Yeah. And that was a while ago. There's been things are moving so fast on this topic. There's so much work being done that it's time for another engagement. So, okay. We'll look forward to it. Well, thank you, Mark. I will talk to you later. Thanks for being on today.
Yep.
Another huge shout out to Mark Curtis for coming on and talking to all of us today, but also for all of the work that he has done. If you're not in the Hemlock Knots Facebook group, I strongly recommend joining. One thing I love about it is the diversity of voices that are there, and a lot of historians engage. It's really a good space to be. It's one of those good spaces on the internet. And also, I know Mark has been releasing more videos, and I highly recommend those. So again, just so many incredible people have done great work in this space for many years, and Mark is definitely one of those. So thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.